Hello there, and welcome to this presentation about view models in Android. My name is Neil and I'm an intermediate developer at RetroRabbit. Now it's my hope that by the end of this presentation that you'll understand why view models is such an important part of the Android toolkit, and that you'll also be able to implement view models in your own code base. So in order to demonstrate the power of view models, I've made this simplistic application. Now, being a big Pink Floyd fan, I made an encyclopedia of some of Pink Floyd's best albums. Now, the first thing I want to bring your attention to is this top section. Now, this label over here is a convenience label that indicates the amount of times we fetch the data below from our make-believe server. You can also manually fetch the data by pressing this button. As you'll see, this will increment this label, indicating that we fetch data twice now from our server. Then there's also a detail page if you select one of these albums, and that will show you the tracks of that particular album. If you navigate back, what you'll notice is that another fetch occurred. Now this is because we fetch data every time on this particular fragment's onViewCreate lifecycle. Now this behavior is not ideal, as it means that every time we navigate back from a child fragment we will fetch data again. This will mean the user will use up additional unnecessary data. In a real life situation where we actually fetch data from a server, this will also introduce additional loading time. Another issue I want to demonstrate with this application is when we change the application's orientation. What you'll notice here is that our data fetch counter label reset back to 1. This is because in the event of an orientation change, the application is reset on an activity level. This means our fragment was entirely recreated. Now these are just some of the issues we want to address with our view model. Before I show you how to implement view models, let's just go through some theory first. View models form part of the MVVM architecture, or Model View Model architecture. This is the recommended architecture from Google. The idea is to make use of models to contain your application data, views such as activity fragments to implement your user interface logic, and view models as the connection between your views and your models. View model should contain your business logic to process any data before it's consumed by your views. As mentioned before, the main purpose of view models is to contain your application's business logic. Another key attribute of a view model is that it lives independent from its associated activity or fragment's lifecycle, as indicated in this illustration. The last thing you need to know is that Android view models use live data to expose its content to your views, which uses a observer pattern. Now that we have covered the theory, let's write some code. This is the code for our album's fragment, which is the screen running right now. The first thing we need to check out is these two variables up here, which is our data fetch counter and the album's data. Down here we have a function called fetch album data from server. And this function will fetch the data from our make-believe server, then increment the data counter, and then process our album data, and then update both the counter label with our latest data from the counter, and add the data to our recycler view. This function is called on both the click listener for the fetch data button, and every time this onViewCreate lifecycle is fired. So let's update this fragment to use a view model. So the first thing we need to do in order to add view models to our application is to add its dependencies in our app.gradle file. So let's quickly navigate there. And then I've already added that dependencies here, but you need to make sure you've added these two dependencies. You can just look on Google's Android documentation for the latest version. So Now that we've got the dependency, let's go ahead and create the ViewModel class. So I'm going to go ahead and create it next to in the same package as our albums fragment. You can just go and say Kotlin new file class, and I will name this album ViewModel. And inside, let's declare this as album ViewModel, and then make sure to extend the class ViewModel. Go. We've created our first ViewModel class. Now navigating back to our albums fragment, we want this data here to live inside our ViewModel. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this and put this here. For now I'm just going to comment this out. As you'll recall from our presentation earlier, in order to expose this data to our views, we need to implement them as live data. Now in order to do that, you need to create two variables. A private variable of type mutable live data, which will allow you to alter it, but we only want data to be altered inside of this view model. And then we'll create another one which will expose the live data we've created to external factors like our albums fragment, but in this case you will only be able to observe the value instead of altering it as well. So let's create that code. This will be of type mutable live data. And that will be of type integer. And then for the public one, which will be normal live data extending integer, implement the get function here and simply return the data fetch counter. And there we have it. So we have our mutable data of type integer, which will only be able to change and access inside of this ViewModel class, and then the public exposure, which is a non-mutable version of live data. Let's implement the same for the albums data. Now that we've got our data as live data, I'm just going to remove this code up here. Next, let's implement this view model on our albums fragment. So in order to do that, the first thing we're going to do is create a new latent variable for that. I'm going to call this album view model, and it's going to be of type album view model. And then on view create, we're going to initialize it. So in order to do that, we're going to say album live data, or album view model, sorry. And this will be of type view model providers. And what this does is it we'll check on this current fragment if there's already an existing view model, otherwise it will spin up a new instance. And we will provide this as owner, and we will say get, and our view model name, so it was album view model class Java. And there we go, now we've got an instance to our view model. Next we want to observe the data inside of it. So if we call it, you'll notice here we've got our the data, and we also have the data fetch counter variables here. So let's do the data fetch counter first. Next you can just say observe, and then we will say view lifecycle owner, and then we'll create a new observer. And this, every time the data inside of our view model changes, as in this particular case the data fetch counter changes, this lifecycle hook will fire, and here we can simply now display this data on our text view. So we've got our counter label text here, and then instead of using the class variable, we'll simply display the returning data. So let's do the same thing for the album data variable. Okay, and in this case we want to display this data on our recycler view. So now you can just move this data up here, again use the returning data. So now currently we're only observing the values as they change, but the values will never actually change inside the view model. So let's do that next. So looking at this function, this entire function can be considered business logic, especially since this line of code here is no longer required, as well as this line of code here, because this will now happen inside of our observers. So I'm just going to go ahead and move this entire function to our view model class. Now in this case, I think there should no longer be a private function, so we would like to trigger this from outside of the view model. This will fetch data from our make-believe server, and then in turn it will assign this value to our data fetch counter to the mutable life data version. So instead we're going to say update the variable name, and then in order to update the value we'll simply go dot value, and here now the important thing to know is this value is a nullable version. So we'll just do a quick null check. And then here we will say its value should be incremented. And then we'll do the same for our for our album data as well. Now I want this data to only be fetched when this view model is initialized. So we're going to create a new init block, which is the constructor for this view model class. And here we're going to do two things. We're going to initialize the data counter, set its initial value to 0, and then we are going to fetch our data from our server. This means we no longer need to implement this logic, but we still have this click listener to update. And this should be as simple as calling the view model model, and then say fetch data from server, and this is no longer required. Okay, so now that we've implemented that, we can go ahead and remove our class variables over here, as these are now available inside our view model. We just need to update this last section here, which gets a specific item out of our album data list, but now this variable is inside the view models. So we can simply go and say album view model dot album data. Now remember, to get the data from it, it's a value, and again in this case it's a nullable value, so you need to check for that, and then we can here just go and say get and remove the last section, and this should function now. Okay, and running the application, let's see how it looks. So we still have our data count up here, and this button still functions. So this is now calling the fetch data function directly from our view model. Then navigating to one of these screens, we still see the track list, but most importantly right now, if we navigate back, we'll notice that our data counter did not increment. This is because the view model lives independent from the life cycle of our fragment, as mentioned before, and it will keep up an instance of this thing regardless if we navigate to and from this particular screen. Now there's one last thing we need to do. Currently, moving to and from this screen to the detail screen, we store this data on the main activity. But wouldn't it be great if we could access the view model directly on this detail fragment as well? So let's implement that code. Okay, so in order to share the view model between two fragments, we're going to slightly change how we initialize it. So instead of doing this code here, we're simply going to alter the variable up here. So it's no longer going to be a latent variable. In fact, it's no longer going to be a variable at all. It's going to be a value. And here we are simply going to say by activity view models. And then we don't need that. And what this does is, instead of initializing the or associating the view model with this particular fragment, it's going to associate it with this fragment's activity. And this means if we copy paste this data of this variable and we add it to our detail screen up here, we will get the same instance of our view model if one already exists, since it's now associated with the activity. So now all we need to do is, on this view model, we'll create a new function here for selecting an item to store the selected item in. We'll give it the position. And then what we'll do is we'll just create a simple, now that we don't want to observe this particular variable, so we'll just create a normal variable called select item, and it should be of type nullable variable, and initially we'll set its value to null. And over here we can say selected item equals our album data dot value navigate position. In our album fragment, instead of storing this now on the main activity, we can just simply go and say ViewModel dot set on selected item and provided the incoming position. And we can completely remove this functionality here, and back in our detail fragment we can change this functionality here to get the data from our album ViewModel.selected item. Okay, so let's see this logic in action. So navigating to our albums fragment, so we didn't change anything major here. We still fetch data as normal from our view model, however now it's associated with the activity. So that means if we navigate to one of the detail pages, we get this information directly from that same view model instead of storing the data on our activity. And there you have it. We've successfully implemented view models in our application. Okay, there's one last thing I want to show you guys before I end this presentation, and that is how to implement data binding. Now, data binding is used to replace find view by ID functionality, and its biggest advantage over find view by ID is that it creates the references to its layout elements in compile time instead of runtime. But it's also a very powerful tool to use in combination with view models, as you can bind the view model directly to your layout file. So let's see some code how to do this. Right, so the first thing we need to do in order to add data binding to our project is add its dependencies. Now, unlike normal dependencies, this one you'll add under the Android tag. So you'll simply create a new section and you call this build features, and inside of it we will create data binding true. We'll sync this, and then on our details fragment we're going to implement the data binding. So let's navigate to our detail fragment. If you navigate to its layout, so you'll see it's a simple scroll view with a linear layout and then some elements. So what you'll do is we'll wrap the entire layout with this layout tag. Then over here we're going to add a data tag. We're going to add a variable, and we'll call this variable our album view model. And then here in our type we will add the album's view model. And there you go. So next, going back to the detail fragment, we'll need to change how we inflate this layout so it's using the actual data binding we've added. So first off, let's create a binding variable. Variable binding. This would be of type album detail fragment binding. And then over here we will say binding equals data binding util dot inflate. Give it the inflator. We'll provide it with the view we wish to inflate. Container. And false for inflation. And then here we will now simply return binding.root. So now we've created a new binding variable and we're returning its root view as our layout for this particular fragment. This means instead of using this code, we can replace this. So instead of using find view by ID, we can now just go binding dot label name. Similar to this one, and same over here. But currently what this does is it gets the data from our view model, and then it assigns it one by one to each of the text views. So instead of doing this, what we can do is we can go binding dot album view model, and then simply provide it with our album view model. Okay. Next, moving back to our layout, we can add a new text element here, and then we can just add, put in curly braces, and then here make a reference to our variable. So view model dot selected item dot album dot name. I'm just going to copy this line, and similarly you can do the same thing for the release date. And this means that it would automatically, as the data changes in our view model, will pipe this data to our UI. So we can now remove this code. Similarly, we can also remove these assignment lines of code over here. Okay, so before we end this, let's just have one last look at our application. So navigating to the albums, let's first fetch the data a couple of times. Navigating to this. Now we'll still see our data displaying over here, but now we're displaying this via data binding. Navigating back, our data fetch counter didn't update, so we've solved that problem. Also, rotating the screen orientation, you will see the data counter still stays 3, it's not being reset like when we initially demoed this. And there you have it. This is how you implement view models in an existing application. For more, I would recommend referring to the Android documentation, because unlike most other frameworks, I believe the Android documentation to be quite thorough. I hope you learned something and enjoyed this video. Have a nice day.